Okay. All right. We're going to embark tonight on a study of the doctrine of God. And when we study the doctrine of God, so doctrine is just teaching. That's what the word doctrine means, teaching about God. And the teaching about God is completely derived from what God has revealed. And God has revealed himself in the created order. He's revealed himself in the way we are created. We are created as the image of God. That doesn't mean we should look at ourselves and then try to extrapolate what God is like, but God has created us in a way that we can know him and understand his revelation. And he's revealed himself in how he works through history. And he's revealed himself most clearly in the Bible and in the person of Jesus Christ, who is fully God and fully man. And theology, which part of the doctrine of God, studying the doctrine of God is a part of theology. It's usually the first thing that is addressed. If you were to pick up a work on theology, they're usually called systematic theology or dogmatic theology, which sounds like it's about dogs, but it's not. Or you could have historical theology. Generally, they're all going to start with a section about God. And that's called Theology Proper. So Theology Proper is about God, and then what God has done through Christ in saving his people is what we would just call theology. So Theology Proper is foundational to understanding everything else that God has done. And when we are doing theology, it's different from any other discipline. And when I say discipline, I mean a scholastic type of pursuit. In every other pursuit, you can, the subject is basically open to your interpretation and to your imagination, right? You have to infer things about other things. But theology is done based on, it's from the top down. It's based on from God's revelation. God has revealed to us what he is like, and he's given us his spirit to teach us how to understand his word. And so we're completely reliant on him to know anything about him. And that's the same it would be actually with any person. You can look at what a person does and look at what a person says, or look at what a person, how they dress and how they act. But until they actually say something and tell you about them, you can't know anything about them. And God is in an analogous way like that. We wouldn't know anything about God unless he tells us. And what he tells us is in his word, and in the other places that I mentioned, we're going to be looking at his word. That's the highest place where we would find revelation of God. And I want to start tonight talking a little bit about who God is and the difference between God and us. And so I have some passages which I'll put in the chat, which are not on the outline. Let's see. Let me make sure I put them all in the chat. I have 4 passages that I want to look at to start with. And I'm not going to be looking at the Isaiah passages, which are on the outline. I won't look at those right now. They will come up later in another part in the outline. So instead of going to Isaiah 40 or 46, let's start with Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. So I don't know if Shirley, you can't see the chat, right? You don't get any of the chat messages.
Right.
Okay. So we're going to be in Isaiah 55, 8 and 9 to start with.
Okay.
And
got it.
Okay. And let me ask Becky to read that if you have that.
Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So
a passage we're familiar with. We've encountered this before. Yep. God is emphasizing the difference between the creator and the creature. And we'll refer to this. There's actually in theology a term which has, several hundred years of usage, which is called the creator and creature distinction. And this is what's being highlighted by God here. He's saying, I'm different. I'm not like you. and you can't think my thoughts. You can't think what I'm thinking. You can't guess what I'm thinking. My thoughts are so much higher. They're actually in a different order, or the way historically Christian thought is thought about it is that God is in a completely a different order. He is transcendent. And so this has implications for understanding his self-revelation, which is what the Bible is. The Bible is the revelation of God, the self-revelation of God. And so we'll talk about those implications, but God is saying here, my thoughts are categorically different. They're the gulf between, us and the highest heaven. Maybe you can measure that in miles, but the intent of the passage is to say there's a impassable gulf between God's thinking and our thinking. The next passage I want to look at is Psalm 17, 13 through 15. And who's got that? Mom, do you have that?
I do. Rise up, Lord, confront them, bring them down with your sword, rescue me from the wicked. By your hand, save me from such people, Lord, from those of this world whose reward is in this life. May what you have stored up for the wicked fill their bellies. May their children gorge themselves on it, and may there be leftovers for their little ones. As for me, I will be vindicated and will see your face. When I awake, I will be satisfied with seeing your likeness.
Isn't that last verse just stirring, right? You can feel that. I can feel that in my heart. So there's a contrast here, right, between the wicked, whose portion or reward, as the version you read, Mom, what is that, the NIV?
Yes.
Okay. Whose reward or portion, I'm looking at the ESV, says whose portion is in this life. That's the wicked. And it was interesting with the NIV, it sounded like there was some, like the next part of that verse was translated in a way that sounded like it was that God's going to give them bad things, right? But this is how the ESV translates the same verse. So verse 14, deliver me from these wicked men by your hand, O Lord, from men of the world whose portion is in this life. You fill their womb with treasure. They are satisfied with children, and they leave their abundance to their infants. As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied with your likeness. The ESV translation brings out this thought that the wicked are rewarded in this life, and even if they get good things, these are good things. They're satisfied with their children, and they leave their abundant inheritance to their children. The psalmist says, I won't be satisfied with anything but you. And when I awake, now obviously he's awake when he's writing this, now he's speaking metaphorically, right? When I die and go to sleep in the metaphor, and am then brought into your presence, I will be satisfied by seeing you, seeing your likeness. And the thought there is that he's not seeing God as God is right now. He's seeing God as mediated through revelation. That might be a new concept for some of us, that we're not seeing right here God as he is. What I mean as in himself. We see how God has manifested himself through the scriptures and through history and through Jesus. But that's mediated revelation of God. That is, to use an analogy, which I shared in another study earlier the week, the church has consistently used this analogy of white light going through a prism. And on one side of the prism, you see all the variegated colors, and they all look separate. Blue doesn't look like yellow, and that kind of thing. They're all separate. And what we are seeing is actually the white light, but it's been refracted through the prism. And Christian theology, when it comes to the doctrine of God, because of this separation, this creator-creature distinction, because his thoughts are so higher, and because of passages like this one in the Psalm here, where the psalmist says, when I awake in the resurrection, then I'll see you. Christian theology has always held to the idea that what we are seeing in God's revelation through the scripture is we're on the other side of the prism. We're seeing God's single glory displayed lots of different ways. But when we awake on the other side of the prism, we will see God, we will see the white light, in the analogy. I'm not saying that God is light, but that analogy is actually used by the apostle too, when he calls God, the light, unapproachable light, unapproachable now. So it's and the reason I'm bringing these things up is because it is going to have application to how we proceed in understanding the doctrine of God. So we'll talk more about that. So the next verse is 1 Corinthians 13:12. So 1 Corinthians 13:12.
You have 15:12 written in the chat.
That's wrong. It's 13.
Okay, it's 13. Okay.
Thankfully, one of the differences between God and us is that God is perfect and never makes mistakes.
Yeah.
Or what a terrible, terrible God to believe in. A God that doesn't make a God that makes mistakes. That would be a terrible God to have.
And this was actually the verse that came to my mind a few minutes ago when you were talking about this seeing through a prism.
Right. So
Yeah,
this is
Me too.
very similar idea. And we know this passage because it's in a chapter that we hear about a lot. The love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. Verse 12, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So the thing that Paul is talking about there, the example or analogy or illustration, I guess, that he's using is, mirrors were basically polished metal. At that time, they weren't made exactly the same way we make mirrors. And so in a rich person's house, you'd have this metal plate that was highly polished and it would be used as a mirror. But your image in a highly polished metal plate, you can tell it's you, but it's not as good as seeing you, right? And so you see yourself kind of dimly through this poor reflection. And Paul says, this is how we're seeing now. This is the nature of seeing and understanding now in this life, is that we see dimly. We see truly, but we see dimly. But then later, we will see face to face. And what he means there by the illustration is, I will see myself as if I'm looking at myself, face to face, instead of looking at a mirror. And then I'll be known, and I shall know fully, even as I'm fully known. Now, he's not talking about becoming omniscient, knowing all things. He's saying, I will know things that I know now partially and dimly. I will know them fully, adequately, right? Fully, and without any data missing that is necessary. I will know them truly and fully. Now, right now, we know things truly, but dimly. And so this is the same type of thing that the psalmist just had talked about. When he awakes, he'll see better, right? The scales will fall from his eyes. Basically, he'll see much better than he sees now. And And then the last passage I want to look at is Isaiah 57:15. And this one says, "For thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place." And we've talked about this. God is different than us. He's in a high and holy place. He's transcendent. That's what this means. He's other,
Mhm.
right? The verse continues, "And also with him who is of a contrite and lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite." What this says to us, this is a great encouragement to us. There are many, many passages we could have looked at to get to this point, but the encouragement is that as we come to God, as it says, humble and contrite, as we come to God and submitting ourselves to him and our thinking to him and our hearts and our lives to him, he condescends. He comes down from the high and holy place in this verse to dwell with us. And this is, so condescension has a couple of different meanings. I want to talk about what that means. So condescension usually in our culture has a bad connotation. You're condescending to me, that kind of thing. When it's used in theology, condescension doesn't mean a bad thing. What it means is that it's a word used to describe that God, God comes down to our level. That's what's meant by condescension. God comes down. We are not elevated to godhood. God doesn't bring us up into, the Holy of Holies to learn from him, but yet he comes down to us. That's what this passage is about. And so as we come to study his biblical revelation, as we submit ourselves to him and humbly want to learn from him, he will revive us and teach us and all of the things, what he promises here. So the divine condescension is not a bad thing. It just means he comes down. Another way to say it is, well, let me put some of these ideas together now. So one of the ideas was, we don't see God as in his essence. We see God as mediated through his creation, as a light going through prism. So we see that. And another way to say that is that God has accommodated. Now, the reason that has to be like that is that because we cannot comprehend God. And so God accommodates his language to us, accommodates his revelation to our frailty. Calvin said that it was obvious that how God speaks to us in the scriptures about himself is like a nurse lisping to a baby, kind of singing a baby song. And that God accommodates his language to us, who in that illustration are the little infant, and speaks to us in a way that we can understand. So what this means is that we are going to encounter language about God. I'll mention some right now, where God says things like, he has come and take shelter under my wings. Now, we all understand that's a metaphor.
Mhm.
Or at least I hope we all understand that. There have been people in the history of the church who have thought that was actually a description of God. Just like when God says, my strong right hand and my eyes rove to and forth over the earth. And even when he's talking about his emotions, my anger burned hot. These are all typically understood to have been to be anthropomorphisms or zoomorphic, which is using the animal kingdom to describe God. These are type of the accommodated language. He speaks in a way that we can understand. You could include under those passages things like where God says, I repented that I made Saul the king. Well, God is perfect. He doesn't change his mind. He doesn't repent. And so we take those passages to be speaking in an analogical way. That's how you would say it. So the creator distinction is really important to remember, because when we talk about God, we're talking about being itself who is completely different than us, but who has revealed himself to us according to our capacity to understand. And so that should give us humility as we approach the subject. Mom.
I want to make a comment on this last passage. Look at it, and I say introduction of the word condescension as a description of what this is about. I love that, because my understanding of the prefix con is that it means with, to be with. God has descended from his high, lifted up place to be with us.
Amen. Yeah.
On the other hand, when a person condescends, he thinks he's descending from a higher place when in fact,
Right.
that's the difference between God condescending and another person condescending. Yeah, I
Right.
like what you said.
That both of those are really good observations. And so, Mom, your comment leads into the next point in just this introductory part here, which is that our understanding of God, our theology, and that word theology, so theo means God, and ology is the ending, the Greek ending that is put on a lot of disciplines, geology, things like that, which means the study of, or the knowledge of. So the knowledge of earth, geology, the knowledge or study of God, theology. So theology leads to doxology. Doxology, that word means praise, worship, submission. So this is where theology should lead. If it just leads to, wow, now I'm smarter than you, then you might turn out to be condescending in a bad way. The revelation of God in a lot of places is meant to show us how weak and needy we are and how all sufficient God is, and that should lead us to praise. It shouldn't be that one such as he would come down and be with me, bring me to himself. This is a great thing. So that's where we're trying to get. We're not trying to just get head knowledge, although there is a lot of thinking involved in the doctrine of God. There's a lot of concepts that you need to think carefully about, and we'll be challenged, I'm sure, as we go through, and maybe it's been challenging already a little bit. So I'm going to move next into the second part on the outline, just two short confessional statements about God, unless somebody has anything they want to add right here. Okay, so what a confessional statement is, I think most of us go to churches that have confessional statements, but if you don't know if your church has a confessional statement, you should ask your pastor, or you should look at your website. But most of us have confessional documents that our church has affirmed as representing the biblical teaching on all of the subjects that the confession talks about. And I'm quoting here from two confessions that came out of the Reformation period, but they're not the only ones, and they're not even the most detailed or thorough ones, and I didn't want, I could put the Westminster Confession section about God on here, but it would take up 3 pages. So I thought we'd just start with these. I wanted to just show you an illustration, and I want to encourage you to read the confessions of the church, because they are written by people who were very gifted by God to summarize biblical teaching. And a lot of them, you can find them online. You can find them all online. In a lot of places, you can find them with the scriptural references for each statement, and you can look them up yourself. So the Belgic Confession of 1561. Now the Reformation started in 1517. So this is right on the aftermath of that. Article 1. We all believe in our hearts and confess with our mouths that there is a single and simple spiritual being whom we call God, eternal, incomprehensible, invisible, unchangeable, infinite, almighty, completely wise, just, and good, and the overflowing source of all good. I think we understand all the words there, except maybe the word simple. I'm fairly certain that nobody here knows what the word simple means in this context. Do you see it there? It's on the second line. We believe there's a single and simple spiritual being. And
it's counterintuitive, right?
it's counterintuitive, right? It sounds like God is really complex, right? So let me just say something about simplicity and who God is, or God's revelation, and then we'll study it in greater detail in a couple of weeks. It's one of the topics that we'll come up on, but just so you can see what it is in the confession. So this is a standard Christian confession. It goes back all the way to the 2nd century, that God is simple. And you can find it in confessions and creeds all the way up, and in systematic theologies, all the way up to the present day. There is currently an attack on simplicity, which is happening from within the church. And this is because I think it's not a concept that we think about a lot, and it seems counterintuitive. And but what it means is that, here it is. Are you ready? God is not composed of parts. And you thought it was going to be a big deal, huh? So let me tell you why that's a big deal, and we'll actually study it a little bit later, but just so you can understand it in the confession. So what would it mean if God was composed of parts? Well, what it would mean is this: that God was dependent on his parts for his existence. Further, it would mean that God was dependent on the composer. Whatever is composed of parts has to have a composer, somebody to compose it. If God is composed of parts, we shouldn't be worshiping God. We should be worshiping the person, the thing, the person, the entity that composed God. Okay, now it sounds profound. Now, and it is profound, and it has implications for, in the Trinity in the doctrine of the Trinity, and God is not composed of 3 parts of God. The Trinity is one essence, one single, simple essence, uncomposed. 3 distinctions, 3 persons. So anyway, we'll talk about it. It turns out to be a very, very important doctrine, and it's confessed here in the very first sentence of one of the earliest Protestant confessions. So we see it there, but we see all the other things too. Eternal, incomprehensible, invisible, unchangeable, infinite, almighty, completely wise, just, and good, and the overflowing source of all good. And of course, you could list a lot more what are called attributes. You could list them there, and they would be biblical. The 39 Articles, 1571, Article 1. 39 Articles is Anglican, but it was also adopted by the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church has a version of the 39 Articles, which I believe still retains this language. There is but one living and true God, everlasting, without body, parts, or passions. Notice the comma, without body, comma, parts, comma, or passions, of infinite power, wisdom, and goodness, the maker and preserver of all things, both visible and invisible. And in the unity of this Godhead, there be three persons of one substance, power and eternity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Did you notice the language of pirates there? And in the unity of this Godhead, there be three persons. There be three. One substance, power, and eternity, the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost. Now, I probably can guess that there's some questions about what does that mean without body, comma, parts, comma, or passions? Some people object to that language too. And when we get to that, that will come under immutability, that God is unchanging. So we'll talk about that. So if you can hold your objections until we get there, that would be good. What I want you to see with these confessions, though, is that these are descriptions of God that are biblical. These are based on the Bible, and using biblical language to describe God. These are not definitions of God. God is beyond our comprehension, meaning we can't draw a circle around him. We can't know him fully, so we can't define him, but we can describe how he has revealed himself and what he has revealed. And so that's what these confessional statements are intending to do, is to describe the way God has revealed himself in the Bible. So that brings us to point 3, heading 3, the existence of God. So the Bible never actually argues for the existence of God. I'm sure you've heard this before. The Bible doesn't present, there's no chapter that you can go to that gives you the 5 proofs that God exists or anything like that. Most people throughout history have recognized the Bible, that God is just a given. The Bible assumes the existence of God, which is really a post-Enlightenment way of talking. Nobody prior to the Enlightenment would have said the Bible is assuming this, because they would have said there's nothing necessary to assume. Obviously, there's a God. We're more skeptical, our age. And so we say, well, the Bible takes this position, there's a God, and it just assumes it. But the fact of the matter is, the Bible is the revelation of that God. And so obviously that God exists. Some of the reasons why the existence of God is a given in the Bible is because all people know God already. You can look at Romans 1, 18 to 21. Don, you got that?
Yeah.
What's it say?
What is revealed is God's anger from heaven against all the godlessness and the wickedness of people who in their wickedness keep oppressing the truth, because what is known about God is plain to them, since God has made it plain to them. For ever since the creation of the universe, his invisible qualities, both his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, because they can be understood from what he has made. Therefore, they have no excuse, because although they know who God is, they do not glorify him as God or thank him. On the contrary, they have become futile in their thinking, and their undiscerning hearts have become darkened.
Thank you. So this is Paul writing about how God has revealed himself to all people, and why people are currently under God's wrath, and what the need for the gospel is. And he says here that what can be made known about God has been clearly revealed by God and made known to every person, so that every person is without excuse. And that even though they knew God, so you notice that They knew God. They didn't just know something about God. They knew God. They suppress that knowledge of God that they have, and they replace it with, other things as it goes on in the passage. If we were to read more, they replace it with the worship of man-made things or with things in creation. So the Bible teaches, and it's obviously true, that every person already knows God. So the assumption, the Bible's not assuming the existence of God in the way that we might first think. It is addressing people who already know this God and don't need an argument for it. And so another argument or another way God has made himself known is in creation. Paul mentions that here. He says, verse 20, the invisible attributes of God, namely his eternal power and divine nature. Now that encompasses a lot. Eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. This is what people can know just by looking at the creation. Another passage that's useful for that is Psalm 19. And I think it's 1 through 4. Mike, do you have that?
Yes. Psalm 19.
Yeah, verses 1 through 4.
Wait, 18 is long. Okay, so 19, verses 1 through 4. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens, God has pitched a tent for the sun.
Thanks, Mike. So that last phrase you started to read there continues in the next sentence, but it's slightly changing the subject in the psalm from the revelation of God in creation. The first 4 2/3 verses are about the revelation of God in creation. So this one says that the heavens declare the glory of God, what that means. And then it goes on to describe that even without words, even though there's no sound, that their witness to God, their witness to God is going out continually. It's constant and universal, and it is ubiquitous. You cannot not encounter it, and so everybody knows. Everybody, you can apply that not just to the starry sky, but you can, look at your pet dog, and you will conclude, if you think about it at all, that there's a God. You could look at a tree and conclude the same thing. That's the point of the psalm, that these are all testimonies to God, and not just any old God, but a God, his divine nature, some things about his divine nature and his eternal power. That's what Paul says. So this God has revealed himself to all people, and all people know this God in some sense of knowing. And so this is, why the Bible doesn't argue for the existence of God, because God has created the whole creation as an argument for his existence, and he's also created us. So I have in the outline that what we've been talking about here is, God's revelation of himself in creation, that this is the basis for some modern arguments for the existence of God. There are lots of arguments for the existence of God, and if you go to YouTube and you type in arguments for the existence of God, you'll get thousands and thousands of videos, and some of them are worth watching, and most of them probably aren't. But says I have written that the fact about God's revelation in nature, showing people who he is, that this fact is the basis for the argument from design for the existence of God. And this is also known as the teleological argument for the existence of God. Telos or teleological argument. That word just means purpose, with purpose, or design implies the same thing. It was designed for a reason, for a purpose. There's a goal. The basic argument from design for the existence of God goes like something like this. When we look at when we look outside of our window, when we look at the nature, we can see order, and we can see some. We conclude. Well, I'll do the argument like this. When you see a building, you assume, and you know actually intuitively, that there was a builder. When you see a painting, you know that there was a painter. And so when we see the creation, we know that there's a creator. That would be the short form of the argument from design. Everybody knows that intuitively. A lot of people suppress it, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't clear. So, if we go to Romans 2, we'll see a second way that God has revealed himself to all people. Romans 2, verse 14 and 15. And Gary, do you have that?
Yes. So when Gentiles who do not have the law instinctively do what the law demands, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Their consciences confirm this. Their competing thoughts will either accuse or excuse them on the day when God judges.
Thanks, Gary. Paul's talking about the constitution of humanity, of people. The way God created people was that they knew God's moral character, that this is written into the way that we're created, written into us as creatures, I would say it like that. And when he says, when the Gentiles who do not have the law, he means they don't have the Jewish law, they don't have the written law, the law and 10 commandments. But so he says, when those Gentiles who don't actually have the 10 commandments, and God didn't give them the 10 commandments, when they by nature do what the law requires, so they refrain from stealing and, etc., they're a law to themselves, not in the bad way of our modern way of that guy's a law to himself. He's autonomous and he's trying to make up his own laws and own rules for himself. But in the way that what Paul means is they show that they themselves, within they themselves, there is a law. They are a law to themselves. Even though they do not have the written laws, what he means in the next phrase, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work, or the work of the law is a way of saying the behavior that the law demands. They show that the behavior that the law demands is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. So two things are going on. God has written the law into our very constitution as his creatures. And so, which is to say, we have the moral imprint of the character of God on our heart, or in our being. And so when we, steal the slice of orange, to use C.S. Lewis's illustration, we know it's wrong. And then when we violate that law that God has written on our hearts, our conscience tells us, you're guilty. And that's what he means by the end. So there's two things going on, the law and the conscience. So everybody knows, obviously the argument would go like this: if there's a law, there's a lawgiver. That's the way that argument would go. And So this is the moral argument for the existence of God. It's biblical. It's biblical in the sense that you can see the Bible talks about morality and its relationship with the existence of God. Here, the fact that people know right and wrong proves that God exists. That's if you were to frame this as an argument. But what Paul is saying is that God has made people in such a way that they already know God exists. So let's turn the page. We're on page 2 of the outline. We're racing through this. I think we're going to have to go slower from now on.
Take it easy, Chuck.
Take it easy. I got a rather long footnote there. I'm not sure if we want to really look at it, but I think it's worthwhile looking at. So we'll just look at it here. I'll read it. The existence of God is also evident to each person intuitively through simple reflection on our human condition. When we think about ourselves, we come to certain conclusions about ourselves. And here are some of them. If you're like me, you can come to these conclusions. We are finite, dependent, temporal beings who are subject to change and whose existence is not in any sense necessary. Boy, that's talk about self-esteem. Boy, oh boy.
I need a
Knocking
trophy.
us down a peg there.
Some trophies.
Finite, dependent, not just dependent on, for some things, right? I'm dependent for everything. For everything, I'm dependent on another. I don't have life in myself. I need God to give me life and sustain it every moment. And, we have physical reminders of our dependence. We have to eat 3 times a day. We thank God for the food. You should remember you're dependent on God for everything and be thankful, right? That's what this prayer for thanks for food is all about, is remember your dependence on God. I'm temporal and subject to change. I'm also temperamental and subject to change. And my existence is not in any sense necessary. Wow. So what do we think? That's true, right? Everything I just wrote is true about each one of us, right? It's true about every person.
Ouch.
So it's not only true about people, but I continue. In fact, this is true of everything in our experience other than God. When we think of ourselves, we're confronted with our dependency on someone or something outside of ourselves for our life and continued existence. We would not exist without someone outside of ourselves who preceded us and brought us into existence. Most people here at this point would think of their parents. So I say our parents likewise are dependent upon their parents. And so the line of dependent beings goes back in time, right? However, there cannot be an infinite regress of dependent beings. This is a logical impossibility. So here we get with some tough thinking. Who knows what an infinite regress is?
Going backwards forever.
Going backwards forever. Right. So yeah, going backwards forever. So you can't have a line of, think about it like this. You've got dominoes, right? You got a line of dominoes and you're not at the starting end where they're all, you're not the one that knocks it over. You're at the other end, and what you see is the domino fall over. You see the last domino fall. Do you conclude from that there is a line of dominoes that goes back forever and all of them are falling? Or do you conclude that there's a finite line and somebody must have knocked over the first domino? You conclude there's a finite line and somebody must have knocked over the first domino, because there can't be an infinite line because it never would have started falling. So that's what an infinite regress, that's the problem with an infinite regress, right? You can't have a continual line of dependent beings. There has to be an independent being at the very beginning that gets them started. Now that would get you to deism. But what I'm saying is that you can't just explain, oh yeah, I'm dependent, but I'm dependent on my parents, and they were dependent on their parents, and on their parents, and on their parents. It's like, yeah, but if a being is dependent for its very existence, which is what I'm arguing, on another being, then somewhere in that line of dependent beings, there has to be an independent being, right? The independent being has to give existence to the first dependent being because he's dependent, right? So every argument for the for God, or every demonstration for God that we would intuitively know, almost all of these ideas, or almost all of these intuitive things, have this idea of eternal regress and the impossibility of it in them. So we have, we're dependent, and so there has to be an independent being. We're finite, there has to be an infinite being. We're temporal, there has to be an eternal being. They're all the same argument. I'll just go back. I see you thinking, Mike.
No, I was just so this. I mean, you have A and B as like argument from design and moral argument. Isn't this really like a third type? Don't they call it a contingency argument from contingency?
Yeah, there's argument from contingency, and then they can call one from an argument from a necessary to a possible beings, or even an argument from necessary and a contingent being. And they're all the same. So we'll do the necessary being one, which is interesting. So we are unnecessary, which means that you can imagine a world in which you did not exist, right? But you can't imagine a world in which God doesn't exist, because the world is dependent on God.
Mhm.
The world is
Right.
not. The world is not dependent on you, and so we are unnecessary beings. We are contingent, which is another way to say we are dependent on God. But you can't have a line of contingent beings going back forever. There has to be a necessary being. God is the necessary being. Now, once you say that about God, you've also said he's eternal. Do you see that? He's a necessary being, which means he has life in himself and he exists essentially, necessarily. And if that's true, then he's eternal. Now, I haven't used the Bible to prove that. I can prove that from the Bible, but Paul has told us unregenerate man comes to that conclusion because that's what God has revealed to him. I've just demonstrated it with simple logic that, we know this. We know these things. Maybe we haven't thought them out. But if we know that we are contingent, then we know there must be a necessary being. It's like 5 minutes of thinking. And then there has to be something about that necessary being, right? He's eternal because he necessarily exists. If that's the nature of that being, to necessarily exist, he must have existed always. So, unregenerate man knows this, and this study isn't going to be philosophical arguments, but I just want to demonstrate that unregenerate people can they know God, and they know it intuitively, they know it morally, and they know it when they look at the creation, and the arguments are not difficult. The second thing I have in that paragraph, which is in the footnote, the uniformity of nature, is also demonstrates the necessary existence of God, who keeps all things regular and uniform. And Genesis says that God brings about seed time and harvest. So the uniformity of nature is a fancy way of saying that we can do science because things are regular. We can make predictions about the weather because there's patterns. We can tell you what's going to happen probably with coronavirus because we've seen what's happened in other parts of the world. And so we see a regularity thing, and this is how we make scientific discovery, and we can make predictions and things like that. This is how we do medicine. All of our scientific knowledge is based on the idea that there's uniformity, meaning there's patterns in nature. In fact, the scientific method, as we were taught as kids, was you do an experiment and you repeat it And you see if the same thing happens over and over again. And it does happen over and over again because there's uniformity. Now, in a universe which is, so in our day and age, people are saying the absurd thing that the universe is random. You know, that random things happen. There is no God, and so everything that happens is random. There is no reason to expect the uniformity of nature that we see in a random universe. But and so if you can't expect it, you can't do science. You can't have science, you can't have medicine, you can't, none of it, gone. But people do science and people have medicine because God keeps it regular. And so, so it's not the universe being random, and the universe doesn't have a mind. It's not keeping things regular. Everything tends towards chaos if it's not tended to. And so, yeah, everybody knows this. Everybody has gone past the 6th grade. So it's another demonstration that there's a God. So sometimes the reason I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about those things is because I started with the Bible assumes the existence of God. And in our cultural climate today, a lot of people, nobody here probably, but a lot of people think, oh, well, that's just a gratuitous assumption. But it's not. We live our lives every day with the knowledge that God exists, whether we believe in him, say we believe in him or not. We live in such a way that betrays that we believe in him. The atheistic scientist who does science, his doing science makes no sense apart from the God who makes nature regular. So he betrays by his doing science that he acknowledges there must be something beyond the universe keeping it regular. So anyway, I thought I would just include those. Part of that's because we just did a class on witnessing, which was kind of like apologetics, and these are issues that come up. So I hope somebody found this useful and at least thought-provoking. I personally like thinking about the finite, dependent, temporal, subject to change and not being necessary part. I think that's really, and then when we think about God, of course, and we see the biblical revelation, we see that he's infinite and he's independent. He's not dependent on anybody or anything. He's not temporal. He's eternal, and he's not subject to change. He's immutable. And his existence is absolutely necessary. He is a necessary being, not necessary in a logical sense. I mean, he is, but he cannot not be. God cannot not be. I cannot be. I'm not necessary, but God cannot not be. So, so when we started out tonight, I said God is very different from us, completely different. This is what I mean. He's very different, and it's important that we remember this as we go through the attributes. So we have about 20 minutes left. I think I'll talk about the next thing in the outline, which was point 4, the attributes of God. So this is a standard way of talking about the biblical revelation of God, how God has revealed himself. We talk about his attributes. And when we say his attributes, what we mean by an attribute is things like love and justice and righteousness and holiness, that these are words that the Bible says God is holy, God is love, that kind of thing. And in our normal creaturely way of understanding words and attributes, we think of them in a way that is not actually accurate when it comes to God. So I'll explain that in a minute, but let me give the basic definition. The basic definition of an attribute is an inherent characteristic or quality of a person or thing. So an inherent characteristic. So when we say, or we might even just say a characteristic. When we talk about a characteristic of people, you could say of me, that I talk a lot. That might be a characteristic. Or I'm a certain height and certain weight, and I prefer dark colors, or things like that. My eyes are this color, and I have whatever color my hair is today. It used to be blonde, but I think it's gray now. And those are attributes, right? I have 2 hands, attributes. And they're different, right? My hair is different from my hands, and my temperament is different from the fact that I wear glasses. These are different things. And some of these things are not necessary for my humanity, right? We'll talk about this. So here's a philosophical concept that's important for this. God, here's a way God is different from us. God doesn't, I'll say it like this. Here's us. What could you take away from me and I could still be human? We could take away my glasses, my hair, the color of my hair, the color of my eyes. That could all be different. I could have no hair. You could cut my hands off. I could still be human. You could cut both my legs off. I could still be human. I could lose a lot and still be human, right? In fact, if I were to be killed, would humanity disappear? Would human nature disappear? I'm an instance of human nature. I'm an example of a human. I'm a person who embodies human nature. But if I'm gone, I don't get rid of human nature, right? So there's 2 concepts there. One is I have attributes which are necessary and unnecessary, right? I can lose my arm. I'm still a human. My arm is not necessary. It's not necessary for being a human. Okay. God has no unnecessary attributes. God, every attribute that God has is absolutely necessary to his being. You can't take away his love and God still be God. As an example. So as a difference between us and him and the way we think about attributes. Another thing is, in the there's a difference, I've already talked about it a little bit, between our nature and our attributes, our nature and our characteristics. Classically, this has been the difference between substance and accidents. So the substance is the nature, who you are. You're a human being. That's your substance. And an accident is what you have incidentally. Incidentally, you have blue eyes. Incidentally, you wear glasses, right? So when we talk about attributes or characteristics in the classical way of talking about it, those are accidents. Not that they happened accidentally, but that they're incidental to your being, that you could lose them and you would still be a human. God has no accidents. God is pure substance. God is pure nature, divine nature. There is nothing that you can add to God to make him more God, and there's nothing you can take away from God. He has no parts. You can't take away anything. Yeah. Now here's how the doctrine of simplicity, which I briefly defined, impacts our discussion of the attributes of God. God has no parts. This means, the implication of this is that in God, who is the white light, we're on the other side of the prism. On our side of the prism, we see love, mercy, kindness, justice, omniscience, holiness. They're all different colors of light. But God is not holiness plus omniscience plus love plus justice. God is not, that's not how you make a God. He's not composed of parts. God is love. I have love. God is just. I'm sometimes just. God, in other words, these are definitional of God. He has love in all of its fullness. He is love in all of its fullness. He is perfect in love. But he's also, and when you say is, that's an equal sign, right? That God is love, God equals love. But God also is holy. Now, on our side of the prism, holiness and love are the way God manifests his glory and his character. We see holiness and love, and we see them as 2 things. But God is 100%. 100% of God is 100% love. And 100% of God is 100% holy. This is very hard to grasp. It's easy to say, and I think you get the picture, but God is so other, so different that this is one of the objections to simplicity. People don't understand, right? It's incomprehensible how God could be, how love, because then people say, well, are you saying that all of the attributes are identical with each other? On the side of revelation, no. God in his essence, yes. So
All of his attributes are one.
right.
One
If
nature.
God is simple and undivided, if he hasn't been composed, this is where you get. And you can get there other ways too, because he's the fullness of love. God is 100% love. 100% of God is love. I mean, as I said. And you can say that about all the attributes. And so we run into now a challenging thing in theology to try to humble ourselves and say, I see the way God has revealed himself in the Bible, and I see holiness and love and mercy, and I see these separate things. But in God, they're not separate.
It gets really challenging when you think of like love and justice, right? Like sometimes God does an act of mercy, shows mercy, and sometimes God shows judgment and punishment, right?
Right.
And so love and judgment we think of as opposing things, right?
Right.
But they're part of the same nature.
They're the same nature. Go ahead, Mom.
So I'm sure this is way too simplistic. But the closest I could come to this idea is to say God is love, and his love is always merciful and always just and always righteous and always.
Yes. Yeah,
And yet that is too simple.
no, it's not. Actually, it has to be very simple or we can't grasp it. Right. But that what you've said is historically, that's how theologians have described it. God's love is a holy love. God's mercy is a holy mercy. God's holiness is merciful. So they're inseparable, right? They're all used as adjectives to modify each other. And yes, because otherwise what happens is you don't have God, you have some being that is greater than God that composed him with these parts.
Right.
But then you also have a situation where you can pit love against justice. You could say, well, in God, what wins? Is God love? I thought God was love. Doesn't love triumph over justice? You go, no.
Also, it sort of implies that God has to follow rules. Like, oh, well, when does God decide when to be merciful, and when does God decide when to mete out justice and punishment? Like,
Right.
There's some set of rules that say, well, this time I'm going to do this time I'm going to do that, whereas God is always the same. And so for that to be true, essentially love and justice must be one nature.
Right. So it's very hard. I understand, I acknowledge, and I don't think about God like that. Right. I think about God this side of the prism, our side, right? I think about God according to his revelation. But in theology proper, we're trying to talk about God as he is in his essence, right? So we'll talk about how God has revealed himself also, but one of the questions is, is this refracted light that we're seeing? And I think in the nature, I think we have just a few more minutes, so I'll just say a few things about language, and this might be helpful. So there are three ways that you can talk about something, that words can be used. When people talk about God, we say, we use the word good. God is good. And I could say that steak was good. Okay, now I'm using the same word. Now, there are three ways that I could be using that word, three different ways. One is univocally, univocal, which means they're identical. I'm using the word goodness, I'm applying it to the stake, and whatever I say about the stake is true of God and only that. It's univocal. Okay. Think about it like this way, and we usually use a color, purple. We don't usually use it metaphorically or any other way. We use the purple hat, the purple house, the whatever. We use it univocally for most of the time. But in the case of goodness, I don't think you can do that between God and the stake, right? So we're not using language univocally in that case. The second way is to equivocate, to use it in that way. And what that means is that the meaning's completely different. That when I say the stake was good and God is good, that I mean something by goodness, which is absolutely completely different. No crossover at all. See, I don't think that's the way I'm using it. And so the third way is analogical. And analogical usage is that there's something that is similar. Something that's similar, but it's not similar. It's not the same in its entirety. There is a point of similarity. And so I could say, I am good and God is good, and that's analogical, right? I'm not saying I'm good in the way God is in every extent. That'd be univocal. And I'm not saying that the goodness that I have by virtue of God's gift to me has nothing in common with his goodness, no similarity at all. I'm not saying, I'm not equivocating on the word. It's analogical. And it turns out that part of this, you said Calvin's illustration was of a nurse who kind of lisps to the child, speaks baby talk, condescends, accommodates the language. This takes the form of analogical expressions a lot more than it. I don't think there are any univocal statements about God in the Bible. I think they're probably all analogical, because the difference, the creature distinction is so great, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
so that's so what I've been doing, for this session, what I've been doing is trying to kind of orient you to thinking about God. And I know it's been difficult, and it probably isn't going to be indicative. And we spent a lot of time on, say, conceptual things and maybe some philosophical concepts. There will be some of that as we go on, but probably less than in the first hour and a half, because what I'm trying to do is kind of orient you to the historic discussion of the attributes of God, how to think about the language of the Bible. And so it's stuff you already probably knew, but I've maybe given you terms to put those, so you can have a name for the concept. So the last thing I want to say tonight, I guess, is that historically we've taken the attributes of God, which are the way God has revealed himself in the Bible, holiness and justice, etc. And there have been several different ways that theologians have kind of classified these attributes. But the one that is most common is the one that I'm going to use, which is they're incommunicable and communicable attributes. So so we're talking about the virus, right? It's communicable.
Mhm.
You can catch it, right? If it was an incommunicable virus, we could just all go outside. It would be great. So God has attributes that are incommunicable. I'll give you an example. And in fact, technically, all of God's attributes are incommunicable. But the ones that are most obviously incommunicable are the ones like he's eternal. Okay. He's perfect. All right. He's without limit. These are not something that has any analogy in the creature. But there are other ones that God, by his grace, has allowed us to, and these are mostly moral ones, that are seen in some small degree in the creature. Love, mercy, justice, these things are called communicable. Now, the idea there is not that God is taking a little part of his divinity and putting it in us. Remember, God doesn't have parts. He's not doing that. Okay. But that God is creating in us the image, the reflection of his glory, not his glory. He doesn't take parts of him and put it in us. But his glory, the image of his glory, is reproduced in his people as they draw nearer to him. And so these are communicable in that sense. And we read about that. That's what sanctification is, right? So when we talk about the attributes, we talk about ones that are incommunicable, which means the ones that are self-evidently apply to God and don't have an analogy to anything in us. And then the communicable ones, again, we're not saying by that God takes something of his love, by like a material thing, taking something out of himself and giving it to us. That's not happening. But what's happening is God is reproducing in us on the creaturely level this attribute of love or mercy that reflects in some accurate way who he is. So we'll be talking about the attributes under those two headings. I'm going to start with the incommunicable attributes, and we'll start with the great. This was billed as a Bible study. We've read 5 or 6 passages tonight, but it really wasn't a Bible study. Next week, we'll start with Bible study, and we'll look at the great Shema, the confession of ancient Israel. We read some confessions of the historic Protestant church. The confession of ancient Israel is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And that means a lot of different things, all simultaneously. So we'll talk about that, start there. So it's 8:26. Anybody have any comments? I hope nobody's thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry I joined this."
Well, if they are thinking that, tell them to just hang on for a week.
Yeah, hang on.
Well, I could throw you a little curveball of something I've thought about.
Yeah.
What it is talking about the attributes.
Yes.
We were discussing the attributes of God. Well, on the other hand, as far as the attributes of man, besides sinlessness and perfection, what attributes would have been different had Adam and Eve not sinned? What attributes would be different in us?
In us.
If they did not sin.
Yeah. So, right. So they would have been obedient. That would be.
That's big.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, I know perfection and sinlessness will be 2 attributes we would all have at this point, because it's passed down.
Well,
so besides that, what are the different attributes, if any?
Oh, yeah, I'll have to think about that a little bit. And I'm not sure about the perfection, because Adam and Eve everything was good. But
weren't they perfect before they sinned?
If you mean they were not glorified, there's a difference between the glorified state and the state of innocence. So as created, one of the things about them was their will was in a particular state, and their state was they could not sin or sin. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now they could have continued in that state, theoretically, I guess, forever by not sinning. Because once they sinned, that changes, right? But
Right, right.
in heaven, the state of your will be different. So that attribute will no longer exist. The state of your will in heaven will be,
Yeah.
you can only not sin. Right.
Right.
So there's a difference there between being perfect, which would be we would associate with the glorified state, and being so if Adam and Eve had never sinned and they had stayed in that state of innocence, they would never theoretically have gotten to the glorified state. So I think that's one difference that is on the surface of it pretty clear.
Mhm.
So now there are some people that argue, about this. So there are some people that argue that there was a time of probation. Now I'm going to say I'm not sure I see that in the scripture, but there are people who are confident that they see it, and that if Adam and Eve had not eaten of the fruit for whatever this time of probation was, let's say it was 10 days, if they hadn't eaten for 10 days, then God would have confirmed them in righteousness, which would mean that they would have then been made constant in holiness and not have the ability to sin anymore. So some theologians argue that. But again, so in that case, if that's the case, then there wouldn't be any difference between the glorified state, except that I don't think that the created world, see, the world's already created with its own, it's going to wind down. There has to be a new heavens and new earth, I think, still, but not
Mhm.
sure about that. Not sure about that if it was sinless. So
Mhm.
difficult question to answer. But
I'm
I'll
sorry to be so difficult at times.
yeah, you're just a big troublemaker.
You are a problem.
I know it.
Surely you are our problem.
Yeah, I will think about it some more, and if I come up with anything that is biblical, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything else from anyone? Okay, so I'll turn off the recording if I can find my mouse. There it goes.